Good morning. Our call to worship comes from Psalm 111, the first 4 verses. Praise the Lord. I will extol the Lord with all my heart, in the council of the upright and in the assembly. Great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them. Glorious and majestic are his deeds, and his righteousness endures forever. He has caused his wonders to be remembered. The Lord is gracious and compassionate. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mountain fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither to thy help I come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy grace, Lord, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above.
So we're so glad you can join us this morning. I still see people coming in the doors, and we got so many in the sanctuary. We're having a hard time finding places to sit, but that's okay. We love that. That's awesome. Those of you at home, we're so glad you're joining us this morning. So if you're here this morning, you probably have a bulletin, and in the bulletin is a little piece of paper to tell us who you are and give us prayer requests and praises. Way to communicate to the staff, however you want to do it. Tell us what's going on in your life. We just love that you can do that, and then you just put it in the offering plate on your way out the door when you leave, or you could just leave it in your pew. We'll find it. So we thank you so much. Those of you at home, you can call, text, and those of you here too can call and text and Facebook us, however. Reminder, we're still providing meals for the Harmons, and so if there's a link on our Facebook, as well as you could talk to Carol. Carol's in the back corner. Wave, Carol. So she's the one to talk to if you want to help with that. We're real excited about being able to help them out during this hard time. Also, speaking of food, if anybody likes to bake and wants to make little rolls like that one right there for our communion, we would love your assistance in that. We can freeze them. You can bake a whole bunch and we'll freeze them. However you want to do it. We just want to be able to give you that opportunity. But if you have responsibility on your list, don't do it just because you feel you need to. We can buy them. It's fine. But if it's something you like to do, we want you to do it because it's something you just enjoy to do. Also, just finally, tithes and offerings go in the back for those of you who are here. Make sure just do that before you leave. But those of you at home, be sure to mail them so that we get them here at the church. And finally, we will be having communion. So if you came in and didn't get a communion cup that's at the back table, be sure to grab one before we get to the sermon. So make sure you have it. So we really appreciate it. Well, let's continue praising the Lord this morning in song.
Higher than the mountains that I face, heart could fathom such boundless grace. The God of ages stepped down from glory to wear my sin and bear my shame. The cross has spoken, I am forgiven. The King of Kings calls me his own. Beautiful Savior, I'm yours forever. Jesus Christ, my living hope. Hallelujah, praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah, death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Then came the morning that sealed the promise. Your buried body began to breathe. Out of the silence, the roaring lion declared the grave has no claim on me. Jesus, yours is the victory. Hallelujah, praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah, death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Hallelujah, praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah, death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Jesus Christ, my living hope. Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we only want to hear your voice. We're hanging on every word. Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we want to know you more and more. We're hanging on every word. 'Cause when you speak and when you move, when you do what only you can do, it changes us, it changes what we see and what we see. When you come in the room, when you do what only you can do, it changes us, it changes what we see and what we see. You're changing everything. Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we're leaning into all you are. Everything else can wait. Spirit of the living when you speak and when you move, when you do what only you can do. It changes us, it changes what we see and what we seek. When you come in the room, when you do what only you can do, it changes us, it changes what we see and what we seek. You're changing everything. Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we only want to hear your voice. We're hanging on every word.
Amen. You may be seated. The whole move to tears things, that's really true. And when we gather, whether here, we're gathering between Sundays with individuals or when we're just alone with Jesus, that's the heart, should be the heart and posture of each of us, is seeking more and more of the presence of Christ, that the Spirit would just come and dwell in us and among us, and recognize that, man, when God moves, when the Spirit moves, it changes us, it changes everything. And I love that. I love that. I love this time together for prayer. And if you have your bulletin, pull it out. If you don't, what I'm going to do is just we have kind of a guided prayer that we do each week. That's corporate, and we take some time for all of us to give gratitude and praise, to lift requests before the Lord, and just to come together as a body of believers, because we believe in the power of prayer. We believe in the presence and activity of the Holy Spirit, particularly when we come together around that as a family. And the way we start every week is gratitude. So I'm just going to open us in a quick prayer and then leave some space and silence for you to respond if you have something you're grateful for, which I hope we all do. Carolyn Cotner, walking in this morning, said every step is a step of gratitude. So if you took a step this morning, Carolyn says you should be grateful. So we all have things to be grateful for. And sometimes, man, we need to grab onto those little things. So let's pray. God, we thank you for drawing us in, for breathing us into this place as the body of Christ. God, we really believe that you have orchestrated this gathering, that you are working, that there is purpose and intention for each of us being in this space today. And we give you thanks for that. Lord, I want to speak gratitude to you today for this family. Lord, this is my third Sunday, our family's third Sunday here, and we feel so much a part of this place. And Lord, I feel so much a part of the story that is here, and that is simply because you are working, and the way you work is amazing. And I want to corporately, God, give you thanks for this place and the opportunity to join here in ministry. Oh, amen. Thank you, Jesus. I'll spend a few moments in intercession. There's a list of kind of current and ongoing prayers that are a part of this family. And in this section, we intercede for our family, for this body of believers, for our community around us. So let's spend some time lifting up those requests to the Father, knowing that Jesus sits at the right hand, interceding on our behalf to the Father for us. So let's lift those to the Lord this morning. Yes, Jesus. Jesus. Yes. Lord, in your mercy, would you hear our prayers, the prayers of the people? Let's spend a few moments in the quietness of your heart, or if you want to pray out loud, we certainly welcome that, praying for our nation and our world. God, in your mercy, would you hear our prayers? Let's take a few moments, both in the quietness of our heart or out loud, to give praise, either things that you see listed in the bulletin or things that you want to publicly proclaim, knowing that, man, as we give praise, as we testify to what God has done, it's as if we're saying to God, we believe it, we see it, we've seen it, and we know that you can do it again. It becomes this kind of prophetic vision for us as we go. So know that sharing testimony and sharing praise is asking God, as did the prophet Habakkuk, to do it again in our day. So let's give those praises to the Lord. God, we thank you for being with us this morning. We give you praise and we give you honor and we give you glory for who you are, for the way that you work in our lives, for the way that you are working, Lord, as we walk through this path of gratitude and intercession and praise. Lord, may it continue to shape us to be people who are constantly grateful for who you are, seeing first the things that you are doing. May we always be people who are quick to pray, slow to speak, quick to pray, just to give you the praise and the glory that you're due, and also to ask for the things that are heavy on our hearts. God, you know us so well, and you invite us to bring our requests to you. And so we do that this morning, and we also give you praise. Lord, may this rhythm of prayer continue to form and shape us into the image of your Son, Jesus. Lord, we thank you for this day, for this time to gather. Would you be with us as we continue together and worship through song, and continue to be with us throughout this service, God, that we would seek the presence and power of your Holy Spirit in our lives today. And everybody said, amen.
Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my blessed thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my life. And be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, and I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. And riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, first in my heart. I my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, all bright and sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all.
Amen. Well, good morning, everyone. Oh, man, I'm causing problems. Well, this morning, we will find ourselves in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And I love the letters to the churches and the church in Corinth from Paul and his instruction to the people. And if you, I need to grab my bulletin so I don't miss any of the little fill in the blankers. For those of you who like to follow along in person or at home, I have, little places to make some notes in your bulletin, and I like to make sure that I don't miss anything. Usually I miss something. Keeps it all interesting. So today we're going to talk about this letter, and the title of the message. Oh, kids! I already forgot something. Children, you are dismissed. They're already going. They don't need me to tell them. You guys have learned real fast. Like, we just do what we do. Nate does his own thing. He often is forgetful. So Gretchen will scold me this week to add it to the list of things she will bring to my attention. Anyways, as I was saying before I interrupted myself, the title of the sermon, Relationships Matter. And this next part, you'll notice about me, I always have like subtitles, subheadings. It's just it's a bad habit. But this is straight from the passage today. Knowledge puffs up, love builds up. And relationships matter is a part of what I would call kind of one of my life maxims or mantras, but I have these kind of three things that guide who I am and how I live my life. The first is Jesus is Lord. I mean, that just kind of covers everything for me. My life, the things I do should orient around the reality that Jesus is Lord of the world, Lord of my life. And the second thing is relationships matter. It's about community and recognizing that Jesus is Lord of my life, calls me to holiness, to live a life that's set apart for the sake of others in the world. So this whole thing that we do, that's this whole Jesus Christian thing, is in community. It's together. And so those relationships are crucial and they matter. They matter because they help shape us. They're relationships of accountability and formation and growth for us as individuals. And the final thing is one of my favorites. I call it the art of the long scope. Like, these things also just take time, and we're going to talk a little bit about sanctification, which is a big buzzword in our denomination, a buzzword that I love to buzz. It's great, but it's important, and it's about this process or this journey. So we're going to get to that, and I also will talk about kind of the theme of this message of Paul's letter, which really, for Paul, his letter to the church in Corinth is about one thing, and that's unity. Now, it's unity in Christ. There is intention behind that, but really what Paul is doing is writing to the church in Corinth. He settles some disputes, and he weighs into some heavy topics for one purpose, and that's to bring unity in the body of believers. I think that is something that we'll talk about that Paul really gets at, and it comes in this, we're going to pull our violin out. Last week we talked about the violin and the tension that creates. And so we'll pull that out today, and we'll think about that, because living in community really is one of the ways that God tunes our hearts. It's the relationships, the way that we live in a relationship with people, how we interact with Scripture and prayer and in conversation, that we don't live in silos or these echo chambers on the side where we just kind of surround ourselves with things that we want to hear, but it is submitting to this larger group of believers, which Paul would say some are weaker, and we'll get into that whole conversation in a little bit. But we're going to pull that violin out, because being a disciple is a call to be like Jesus. It's a call to be holy. And this process, there's an author, his name's Robert Mulholland. He has a book called Invitation to Journey. It's on the process of discipleship and formation. And he talks about this process like this. He says it's the process of being formed in the image of Christ for the sake of others. And I love that. Like there's purpose and there's intention. It's not just an individual me and Jesus journey. Like God is doing something in me for your sake. God is doing something in you for my sake. And as we walk and journey together hand in hand, we make, as we talked about last week, for those of you who weren't here, we talked about violins, we talked about music, and the resonance that they make, and like the sound waves, how they resonate. And afterwards, I was approached by my wife, the science teacher, and Jen Chase, the doctor, Jen Chase, who somebody called her the spit doctor because she does like the spit things at NNU where they're doing the tests for COVID. And I was like, man, I wonder, was Jen here today? In the nursery. Oh, I don't even get to make fun of her. Jen, we're talking about you in the nursery. But I've wanted to ask her, like, has anyone called you that to your face? Like, hey, spit doctor? And is that a term of endearment? So anyways, there was a rabbit trail that had nothing to do with anything. That one was free. So after the service, my wife and Jen were like, oh, that whole like resonance, that whole thing about frequency, there's another piece of that you could add that would be great. And I looked at it, and they schooled me, and I was like, actually, that fits really great for where we're going this week. So with this idea of resonance, we can look at how frequencies, how they interact. And so there's this, when they are in phase, it means they have the same frequency. So when you have sound waves that are what's called in phase, then they're in the same frequency, and then it's constructive interference. And with constructive interference, waves that are in phase, they combine together and they increase the amplitude. I love that. So if we're talking about God tuning our hearts, like this violin, so we have the things that we believe are fixed points, and God uses the tuning pegs, and then it tunes our heart, right? The strings are kind of our heartstrings that send that sound wave, that resonance. When those are in tune with the Spirit, and they find where the Spirit is working in others and in the world, and the frequencies match, it's constructive. And what God does is like amplifies, and it's even better. Is that cool? Like for me, I'm a visual guy, so that's like really cool. Some of you are like, oh, draw the picture. But there's also something called destructive interference. And so when waves are out of phase, when they're not on the same frequency, then they cancel each other out. Now, I'm going to stop talking scientifically at that point because that's the limit of my expertise. And I'll say something that probably doesn't make sense or is wrong. But I love this, the constructive and deconstructive, and recognizing that we desire to be constructive, to build each other up. And that's the whole message that Paul is driving at this morning. And he's hitting at this theme of unity and following the Holy Spirit as we live in community so that we build each other up, so there's a convergence of this frequency that we're emitting as a community that builds this resonance that transforms the world. Because we talk about, right, we're breathed in, we're gathered in the space to be sent. Because in just a few moments, as soon as the long-winded pastor is finished, we go out into the world to be means of grace to a hurting and broken world. So God is shaping us in here in the space, in our time in the Word, during the week, in time of prayer. He is shaping us so that our lives can send these frequencies of resonance of His message and His hope to the world. But part of it, when we get into this message and what Paul gets at with in a few moments when we dive into the passage, talking about the food that is sacrificed to idols, what you should eat, what you shouldn't eat, this is where for us as a holiness people, we talk about, who are in this tribe that looks at sanctification and this process, it's a beautiful thing that is all about being formative. It's all about calling us to be holy like Jesus is holy for the sake of others. It's all about this idea that we're talking about of this resonance and this message that goes out. Where sometimes we can get ourselves in trouble is sometimes what I refer to as how I was raised on the list. I don't smoke, drink, or chew, or go with girls who do, right? Now, that's partially tongue-in-cheek, and I do say this very carefully because I recognize our tradition. I love, and I've talked about this with my family and the church that I grew up in. So this is the hope here, right? Is in this conversation to be constructive, to talk about our tradition and who we are, and to look at what Paul instructs, because there are clear things from Scripture, from the history of Christian tradition, that, man, we're to avoid, the sins that so easily entangle. But if we're not careful, right, that can become prescriptive, where we just have this list. And I would always, when I was a youth pastor, I always talk to teenagers, and I even share this with my kids, like, there are things that we do and we don't do, but if all we do is focus on this list and become very prescriptive, the moment that list goes through the washing machine, then we suddenly aren't left with this idea of being shaped into the image of Christ and looking to Christ to understand who we ought to become. But we're looking at this list of things we don't do, and we're just trying to not do things. So holiness, for me, holiness is about describing, and it's active. It's describing participation in the way of Jesus, and not prescribed or passive abstention from the ways of the world. And again, this is not a sermon where I'm going to come and say, I think we can do all these things, and this isn't one of those. It is simply, as we think about who we are as followers of Christ, who have been called to be holy, who recognize the call to the holy life, who recognize the process of sanctification that brings with it the power and presence of the Holy Spirit to cancel sin and the power of sin in our lives. That we then ought to orient our lives around the person of Jesus and look to Jesus for then our next steps, the things that we do, who we become. And I think for me, that's where the freedom comes. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but that's where the freedom comes, because holiness, a lot of times we see that as in tension with freedom. That holiness and freedom are in tension with each other, like these rules and regulations. We see that in the Pharisees. We see Jesus confront that. I've heard that all growing up as a part of the Church of Nazarene and just Christianity in general, that it can feel so restrictive. And I don't think that is the appropriate message of holiness or the life of Christ or living the sanctified life. Because when you really dig down and look at it, that is where freedom comes. Because we're no longer bound to the chains of sin and all of the things that so easily entangle. We have freedom in Christ. So holiness is not in tension with freedom. Holiness is freedom. Holiness is freedom. And I think we'll see that in some of Paul's conversation. So I'm gonna try something. I'm gonna take a risk. So if you have your bulletin, you have three little graphs. If you have a piece of paper and want to be artistic, you can follow along. I promise it's not very difficult. But I told you, I really love our tradition, and I love talking about sanctification. I was like, I'm just going to do a little visual. So if you have your bulletin, if you don't, you can just draw like it's a simple little graph. I'm going to do this 3 times. And so this is how I learned it from Dr. LeClaire. She teaches at NNU. So on this first dot, we have, I'm just going to write the letters, I, period, S, period. Initial sanctification, also called salvation. I like calling it initial sanctification. Maybe it trips people up, I don't know. But it's that beginning of process and journey. And for me, because we're a people of sanctification, it makes sense. It's when this journey begins. It's kind of the first work as we talk about it. Then somewhere along the way, we have ES, entire sanctification. And then at some point here, glorification. Oh, I'm just going to do a G. Don't write it out. So this is like a process that we recognize that there are these moments, right, where the Spirit shows up, where God does something unique in our lives. But it's all a part of this continued process and growth to glorification, which happens when we meet our Savior face to face. And oh, what a glorious day that will be, right? Well, I was thinking about this week, and I was like, oh, and again, this is just where my mind goes sometimes. Maybe yours doesn't, and that's fine. But and I haven't talked to LeClaire about this, and she'll probably get mad at me, but I should maybe set up coffee. But we have this, and it progresses up, and sometimes that can be problematic. And we'll get to it in just a second, because we see this as growth, and Paul calls this like growing in what he would say knowledge, like we're starting to know things about this whole journey of Jesus and all that kind of stuff. And he says knowledge puffs up. Well, we orient stuff like this in the business world. This is great, right? There's other graphs we're looking at these days where this isn't great, but that's another conversation. But this, that was funny. Thank you for laughing. Sometimes you just have to laugh. It does. I need a smile. Well, I always have a smile usually, so maybe sometimes I don't have a smile. Yeah, I'm looking at my children. So, but in the business world, right, this is like progress, this is growth, and I think in some ways if we look at this, this puts us, if I have been entirely sanctified, I'm so much better than only the initially sanctified. And I was like, okay, so maybe we should do it like this. And just have it like just straight, you know? Just straight. You know, we have your IS, your ES, and your G, glorification. And then I was like, but if you read Jesus, it's like Jesus is all about like downward mobility. You know, like last first last, all this stuff. Servant, you know, if you want to be great, and be served, you know. He rebukes the disciples for talking about who's the greatest, all these things. So then I was like, actually, dude, it's so good. Look at that straight line. Actually, it should be like this. You know? Because if you track Jesus, like, right, he came and he died to bring life. Like, it's backwards. The kingdom is upside down. And I love living upside down. It's so fun. One little thing, I'm going to leave this in a second, but one thing I forgot to talk about that is always moving. One of my favorite little theological words. I'll put a PG, prevenient grace. Oh, can I get an amen? Oh, wow. So in the midst of all this process, right, God's grace goes before, preveniently doing for us what we can't do for ourselves, and we just believe all that. But I just was looking at it, I was like, in the context of Paul's drive for unity, and in his conversation recognizing that first of all, and we'll talk about this in just a second, you don't know as much as you think you do. And second, knowledge puffs up, love builds up. Like, as we think about growth and grace, as we think about the holy life, man, we better armor up with some of this stuff and be like, actually, I need to grow in radical humility as I grow in my relationship with God and as the sanctifying work works in my life. And some folks who I admire and looked up to, that is exactly what I see, is absolute humility. And sometimes in our own insecurity, in our own desire to control, fill in the blank, we can become puffed up, we can become prescriptive, and before we know it, what we've done is divide everything, and we haven't brought unity at all to anything. Oh, question, yes. Oh. Oh, Jan, that is great. Exactly. Do you want to preach the rest of the sermon, or no? Jan, that is so good. You know what I love the most, Jan, is I know that you can ask a question in a sermon. Like, if you don't know me very well, like, I am interruptible. Because sometimes I want someone to interrupt. But Jan, thank you. That is so good. I like that. We're full of, and that's what I began to think about. Is like, man, this is like, it's backwards. Like it should, and the emptying of self, right? Philippians 2 and what we see in Jesus, that is exactly it. Oh, now this is great because I got preached to today. So who wants to sign up to preach next week? Like from the pew. I'll send you an email. So that's a little bit of the holiness kind of backdrop. When we get into and look at the passage, right? So Paul is talking about food that is sacrificed to idols, and it's set in the larger context of multiple chapters. So it starts here, it actually goes through 11, verse 1, and he repeats this conversation a lot. He comes back to it, he circles around it, there's some repetition, he refines the argument, and that's all his style of teaching. And again, it's focused on this idea of bringing unity. And what we also see is that it is not prescriptive, because in some situations he's saying, you shouldn't eat food to idols, and some it's okay, and when to abstain and when not. So if you're just reading through, it's confusing. And there's a lot of nuance. And I'm a gray individual, ask my wife. I live in this fluid world. I'm okay, I have confidence in that. I have absolutes of, who Jesus is, so don't worry about me, too much. But I'm okay with this push and pull. But it's really difficult. This nuance can be very difficult for us to navigate. That's why we can sometimes slide into, we see it in the Pharisees, we can see it in the church. Just read old manuals, you'll see it. We can slide into, with good intention, with the best of hearts, to prescription, which can lead to what some would say is legalism. And we want to avoid that. And Paul, I think that's what he is trying to get at. So let's move into verse 1. And in the sake of time, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but we're going to go verse by verse. So if you want in your pew Bible, it's page 1133, or it'll be 1 Corinthians chapter 8. I'm going to read verses out of the Common English. The pew Bible is NIV, so that might read a little bit different, but the themes are the same. So verse 1, now concerning meat that has been sacrificed to a false god, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes people arrogant, but love builds people up. And so with Paul, we see love is the vision that leads to something, and that something is the abundant life and God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. So Paul is taking the readers from somewhere. He's taking us somewhere as we read as well, and that love is this vision that leads to something. It's abundant life, and it's God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. So he's talking about meat. Now, just real quick, meat in this reference, it's referring to meat dedicated to the gods worshipped at the temples in Corinth. So this meat oftentimes was sold at the temples, and it generated income for those places of worship, because very little of the animal that was sacrificed was actually used in the sacrifice. So they had leftovers, and they're like, hey, let's have a yard sale. That's where I think flea markets started, is just selling meat from temples. I don't really think that just randomly came. I think you all know that. Then he says, that wasn't in my notes. So he goes on to say, we know that we all have knowledge. Now this is a line actually that came from the church in Corinth, from people there, to Paul. So he's using their own language back against them, saying that they reference that we know that we all have knowledge. So he's speaking directly to this posture of arrogance in the church. And then he responds with, knowledge makes people arrogant, but love builds people up. He uses their own words, calls them out with their own words, and it's beautiful. It's this beautiful little rebuke. And he's setting them up in a good way. Verse 2 says this, if anyone thinks they know something, they don't yet know as much as they should know. Ugh. How many of you are like, the older I get, I've said this so many times, the older I get, the more I know I don't know. You know? And that's that humility, Jen. I think that gets to recognizing, especially as finite humans, recognizing that we serve this infinite God whose graces are new every morning. His mercies are new every morning. So, of course, there are going to be so many things that are new and fresh. And why don't we approach each moment with humility? Verse 3, he goes on and says, but if someone loves God, then they are known by God. Now, this is where he's getting at this idea of identity and formation and how all this can make sense when we get to this piece of nuance where there isn't just this one-size-fits-all of what we do with meat sacrificed to idols. He starts with this, and sometimes we skip over these important parts. But love of knowledge leads to love of self or idolatry. And love of God leads to being loved by God and in turn loving others. So this whole thing starts with love. When we love God, what comes in return is this reality that we know that we are loved. And that becomes kind of this chicken and egg argument of what's first. And God is always loving. For God so loved the world, right? John 3:16, this thing we love to talk about. And this love transforms. But a love of knowledge leads to the love of self or idolatry. It puffs up. But love of God leads to being loved by God and, in turn, loving others, or what Paul talked about, building others up. So if we jump to verse 4, I'm going to read 4 through 6 all at once here, and then we'll talk about it briefly. So concerning the actual food involved in these sacrifices to false gods, we know that a false god isn't anything in this world, and that there is no God except for the one God. Granted, there are so-called gods in heaven and on earth, as there are many gods and many lords. However, for us believers, there is one God, and the Father. All things come from him, and we belong to him, and there is one Lord, Jesus Christ. All things exist through him, and we live through him. That chunk we talked about both last week and the week before, the Shema from Deuteronomy, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. So here this theme comes again, right? Paul is using something that would be familiar to all people who grew up and who understood what it meant to follow God, follow Yahweh, that there is one God, there is one Lord. And so for us as believers, he's orienting that regardless of what you see, and in Corinth, it's Greek town, man. There's all gods all over the place. There's shrines, there's temples. And so he's like, sure, yeah, we recognize that there are all these gods. The G is low, lowercase. But we know as believers, there is one God. And he's almost kind of flippant, like, so this doesn't matter. Like all that other stuff, that's like just stuff. Because we know the truth. We know that there's one God. But then he goes on. Not everybody knows this. Some are eating this food as though it really is food sacrificed to a real idol because they were used to idol worship until now. Their conscience is weak because it has been damaged. That word, I think, messes it up for all of us. Because in our minds, the way we think about these things, especially when we're following this trajectory of success that goes up, right? To be weak is to be weak, you know? And for Paul, it's like weakness is just recognition of where they're at in the process. So the way he talks about it, right? So there are some, because they were used to idol worship until now. Maybe they're new in the faith. This is all that they've ever known, right? The driver of empathy for other people is to recognize that they're doing the best they can. You will hear me say this all the time. They're doing the best they can. They're doing all that they've been taught to do. And it drives us to a place of empathy, and we can see them for who they are as humans, recognizing that they are made in the image of God, and that our call then is to love them in a very specific way. And there's a phrase that I like to use as well. It goes like this: what you resist persists. And I think for Paul, recognizing that weakness was recognizing that this food and thinking it's sacrificed to idols so I can't partake, for Paul that was weakness. Because then you're reinforcing, right, that something has power over you that doesn't. And that's very common for us, is that what we resist persists. If we're just trying to not do something, my sister has been in recovery for 10 years. And one of the things that I've heard her talk about and other people in the recovery movement is that specific, thinking about not drinking or not using is thinking about drinking. And so that's going to continue to drive. So this idea of what you resist persists. The call then from Paul is to help them move beyond that, recognizing this knowledge, but knowledge that doesn't give you power or puff you up, but that just provides you with humility to say to the weaker brother, like, that doesn't have power over you. And it doesn't give me power to think I'm better than myself, but it drives me to love. And it drives me to a posture that then I'll give something up if it means that it's going to cause you to stumble, which is exactly where Paul goes. There's another line I love to talk about. Sanctification is never about revival or arrival. It is about revival. Arrival. It's this idea of transcend and include. So as God frees us for something, as the power of Christ breaks sin in our life, we transcend that. When we look around and there's others who are caught in those same things, we include. We lovingly do for them what someone has done for us to help us move beyond that. So we don't just stand in this position of superiority, lording our knowledge over people, like, oh man, I moved beyond that eons ago. Oh. But we include them and we we should have like massive empathy and know like, man, I can relate. I know where you've been. And that happens through the power of the Holy Spirit. Verse 10, suppose someone sees you, the person who has knowledge, eating in an idol's temple. Won't the person with a weak conscience be encouraged to eat the meat sacrificed to false gods? Verse 11, the weak brother or sister or whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. Verse 12, you sin against Christ if you sin against your brothers and sisters and hurt their weak consciences this way. And finally, verse 13, this is why if food causes the downfall of my brother or sister, I won't eat meat ever again, or else I may cause my brother or sister to fall. Now, the whole thing about if they see you eating in the temple, that was also common. Like that happened out in the public sphere. It'd be similar to me being at like the Nampa chamber as a pastor to connect in the community or to be involved in leadership. Like taking place in some of these feasts was very common, and it wasn't seen, and Paul was recognizing that's not seen as something that we shouldn't do. But if you have a brother or sister who recognizes that their conscience is weak and they see that and that's an invitation for them to stumble, it's for us to be mindful and cognizant of that because we're driving for unity in the body of believers. And this all drives toward, in this section, the final thing that Paul says in Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1. And people struggle with this. I love this verse, and I think it's great. And I think it's one that we should quote all the time. But it actually, in Facebook a couple years ago, got me in trouble, and I thought it was funny. But he says in verse 11:1, follow me as I follow Christ. And I said that. I just said, and somebody literally said, something to the effect of like, what are you, Paul? It was just like we're supposed, Jesus says, be holy as I am holy. Like Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. Like that means if he's following Christ and he's saying to me, follow me as I follow Christ, if I'm following him, I should then turn around and say, follow me as I follow Paul or Christ. But Paul would say, don't say me, say Christ. You know what I'm saying? It's like, yeah. Yeah, I just watch it on the video and slow it down, like 0.5 speed. To me, it's just like imitate. We're called to imitate Christ, and Paul's saying, follow me, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And we should say the same thing. And again, as Jan pointed out, if we're doing this, the knowledge that we have, the things that we grow, drive us into humility and drive us to be gracious and to be loving and to limit our rights, to recognize that Paul also says everything is permissible, not everything is beneficial. Like this is the highly nuanced world of living in community, which is why I love it, which is why a lot of people struggle, because it gets messy and we have to have hard conversations. I love hard conversations because for me, we're real when we're having those difficult conversations. And I will end with this, a word from the beloved Mr. Rogers. He said this, everything that's human is mentionable, and everything that's mentionable is manageable. So as we're journeying in relationship together and we're trying to navigate all of these things, Paul admonishes the people, like knowledge puffs up, love builds up, drive towards love, and continue to grow. And then we recognize in our process of sanctification, just as Christ, it's a continual emptying of self. It's an emptying of self. I'm going to have the worship team come. We're going to sing one song that I think summarizes this pretty well. And we'll have the questions. There's some questions in your bulletin, and I mean to come back to these every Sunday, and I always forget to, so I'm trying to figure this out. There's some questions just to think about in your quiet time this week. If you want to grab a bulletin on the way out. But these are just some thoughts. Pray for the Spirit to reveal areas where you're puffed up. Pray for the Spirit to reveal areas where you are the weaker brother or sister needing knowledge that leads to freedom. And maybe identify a relationship you can better show love so as to build up and bring unity. And then pray for courage to hear and to obey the Lord in that. So let's sing this song and then we will move to communion.
We are one in the Spirit, we are one in are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord, and we pray that all unity may one day be restored, and they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. We will walk with each other, we will walk hand in hand, we will walk with each other, we will walk hand in hand, and together we'll spread the news that God is in our land, and they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. We will work with each other, we will work side by side, we will work with each other, we will work side by side, and we'll guard each man's dignity and save each man's pride, and they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. All praise to the Father, from whom all things come, and all praise to Christ Jesus, his only Son, and all praise to the Spirit who makes us one, and they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love, and they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love.
Amen. On the night that Christ was betrayed, he gathered with his disciples. If you prepare your elements, he gathered with his disciples in the upper room, and his 3.5 years of ministry had been culminating to this point. And he looked at his disciples, and he took the bread and he held it up and he broke it, and he said, "This is my body that is broken for you. Every time you gather and eat of this meal, remember me. Take and eat." And in similar fashion, after the meal, he took the cup and again looked at his disciples who he had been teaching and leading, and he said, This is my blood of the new covenant. It is poured out for all humanity for the forgiveness of sins. Every time you participate in this, every time you drink, remember me. Take and drink. Father God, we thank you for this meal, and we give you thanks for it, recognizing that this is a part of what you call us to, this sacred rhythm of, and especially in this meal, of receiving your grace and your love so that our hearts and lives can be transformed. And as we go, we can be representations of this meal to those around us. May it form and shape us into the image of Christ for the sake of others. Would you stand as we end our service? We're going to sing the Doxology twice, and then I have a benediction, and then we'll peace out. So let us sing together the Doxology. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Before you sing amen, sing it again. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above, ye heavenly hosts. And praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Now receive this benediction with your arms outstretched. As you go, may you embrace the freedom you have in Christ, who conquered sin on your behalf, and may you live in a way that brings this same freedom for the sake of others. Go in grace to love and serve the Lord.